Today is December the 17th, 2007, and this is part two of an interview with Judge Vicki Miles-LaGrange. She was a senator from 86 to 93 here in Oklahoma, and this is part of the OSU project called Women of the Oklahoma Legislature. The library's doing it. My name's Tanya Finchum, and we'll start. Last time, Miss LaGrange, Judge LaGrange, Miles-LaGrange, I guess we should say, shouldn't we? Because we'll edit all this out.
Okay.
Told us a little bit about her childhood and about her early political aspirations, and then we got up to election night. So today we're going to start with what she recalls from that night, and we'll move forward. So,
I guess the main thing that I recall about election night is that I was the victor, and so I like that a lot. We had worked very hard with not hardly any money, a very limited organization in terms of the number of volunteers. My mother was my campaign manager, and she's a former kindergarten teacher, and her best friend. They were my main volunteers, and we took who we could get. And I ran a very grassroots campaign, and it paid off that night.
And for your swearing-in ceremony, who all came with you?
Oh, it was all of my family. My then husband, Jock LaGrange, and my niece, who's about 5 or 6, Brittany Scott, and my mom and my dad, Charles and Mary Miles, my sister, Gail Miles Scott, my first secretary, who is now deceased, Sheila Wiley Cooper. Jacques' family was there, and my Vassar roommate, Marguerite Barkley, and there were a host of friends and family that were there. Many of my aunts and uncle who were living, George and Margaret Red. Everybody's kind of deceased now. It's kind of sad.
But they were all there.
They were all there. It was great.
Got a good crew.
Yeah, it was great.
Okay, and then tell us a little bit about the first time you presented a bill on the floor.
Yes, I was very nervous, and I think the very first bill that I ever presented was one that was creating. It was a Senate joint resolution, which was a lot easier than a bill, and it was the essence of it, as I recall, was to create a literacy task force. I had been a volunteer through my sorority, through junior league. I was a provisional. I may have been a provisional at the time, right after election, and I worked at a literacy center. I volunteered at a literacy center up on Classen, and I was just appalled with the pervasiveness of adult illiteracy in our state. And so that was my very first effort out there on my maiden voyage. I did some homework with people at the State Department of Education at that time, and tried to, and worked with the Senate staff. They are an extraordinary bunch, the staffers, the professional staffers then, and I'm sure now on both sides of the aisle. Those men and women are very gifted researchers and policy wonk-wonks in their respective substantive areas. And so I went with that, and it was successful, and I was happy, and took a lot of deep breaths, and got it passed, and did quite a bit of work over the next couple of years. With hindsight, you look at how much effort is put in. I don't know how much, let's say, the general populace at large is aware of just the kind of work that goes into any measure in that process of a bill becoming a law. But it's so much work and so much effort and so much dynamic. And as I grew as a senator, I certainly grew in my skillfulness at getting measures passed, and Some people are not too complimentary of that process, but the average senator, the average representative, and this may sound self-serving, but I believe they work very hard and they believe in what they're doing, even if it's something I don't agree with. They work very hard at what they're doing, and they do so honorably to get their measures enacted into law.
Well, were there other goals that you had in mind as you came in that you wanted to accomplish?
I did. I had, as a lawyer in my career at that point, as a lawyer, had been as a prosecutor, and I had a lot of concerns about I had been a sex crimes prosecutor in the Oklahoma County District Attorney's Office before coming to the Senate, and I had also been a trial attorney for the Department of Justice in Washington, and I was concerned about a lot of issues that affected women, families, and children. And if you kind of look through the annals of my little legislative initiatives, I think you'll see a lot of matters. I can think of one that I think it was actually a House bill, but I carried it in the Senate. It was to deal with prenatal care in the state of Oklahoma through the Oklahoma State Health Department. The bottom line was you get out of Oklahoma County and Tulsa County and into some of the very, very rural counties of our state, there was just a dearth of counties that had absolutely zero prenatal care available for pregnant women, and if you don't have good care, you're not going to have good outcomes a lot of times with those babies. And I found myself doing everything from the literacy I had a mammogram bill that was quite colorful that Governor Bellman finally signed, and it wasn't him. I had attacks from little old naive me. I guess I was thinking about old Ben Franklin, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Well, that depends on what the proposed cure is, and not appreciating fully the extent to which that whole other side of the argument of any kind of mandated coverage from the standpoint of insurance companies. Obviously, that's not something that they favor because it's a real cost issue for them. So I got baptized, and I remember my bill dying it died in committee. I had all of the business interest. It was very interesting. But small business people obviously don't like mandated coverages because it costs the small business person more. So you find yourself giving and taking in that process. Your bill may not look like it started out looking. You try to figure out what you're willing to compromise to get your measure through. And there were things that I abandoned, and there were things that I compromised, and I think that's part of just the learning process out there of how things got done. Because by the time I left, I had started to get really fairly adept at getting my measures passed, and a lot of times, lending support to your colleagues on their particular efforts. A lot of horse trading went on. A lot of horse trading, as you can imagine. And that's not a negative. It's just a kind of a way of doing business. And I found myself having to convince people whose interests were very different than mine. I think somebody has said, I don't know to whom this quote is attributed, that in politics there are no permanent friends, there are no permanent enemies, there are just permanent interests. And that kind of speaks volumes just about the process, because I remember my mammogram bill, when it was killed in committee, but did not have a requisite number of votes to be reported out. I remember my bill. I remember going to Senate staff because I remember having seen measures that died in committee, and the next thing I knew, they were reappearing on the floor. Well, they had been attached procedurally to another bill that had some germaneness. And I found out that to continue on with my mammogram bill, which I really believed in, all of the figures, many of which were from the American Cancer Society, showed just the savings to everybody involved. That prevention, that early detection, that's one of the kinds of cancers that early detection could oftentimes make a difference for that person involved. And as I was learning all along the process, and I remember speaking to Senate staff about how was there any way that I could possibly revive my measure, and there was a Senate author who had absolutely no interest in a mammogram bill until I sat and talked to him, and I thought, well, he has a mother and he has a wife and he even has daughters. And that was the vantage point that I went and talked to my colleague, that we basically were always on polar opposite sides of the fence. And when I spoke to him and shared the importance of why I thought that it was so important and why it made good dollars and cents for Oklahoma insurance companies, and by the time the bill actually was signed by Governor Bellman, it was not my original bill. It was my bill that had been tacked on to a funeral home bill.
Oh gosh.
But it was passed, and he voted for it. And he told me that if he saw that my measure, which he knew had been voted unfavorably on in committee, was pulling his bill down, that he was going to detach my amendment, which was the bill that I had lost in committee. It was, I think at that time I got a critical editorial from one of the daily presses that was entitled "Another Way to Legislate," and it was talking about that process of doing that was so unfair. It wasn't like my colleagues on either side of the aisle did not know upon which they were voting. It just that was the only way I could get it to the floor, and I was determined to get it to the floor because I knew that because we all have mothers and wives and sisters, that there was a broader interest there, and there was a more common interest that went beyond the interest of an insurance company or a small business person, or even, there was something that was in common, and that was the data about what an early mammogram could do in the fight against cancer, breast cancer. And so I found myself chuckling that I was criticized for doing what I saw as a normal practice, because an author, whether it's something I agree with or not, that's insignificant. But if you want your bill passed, you want your bill passed, and you will go for it in any legitimate or procedural fashion that you can get it done. And thank goodness Governor Bellman felt the same way, because ultimately, as you know, the governor enacts the bill into law once it passes both houses. And so we were able, there were a lot of compromises along the way, but we were able to get that bill passed. And I had been asked to carry that bill. It was not a Senate bill, it was a House bill. The late Representative Freddie Williams found herself as a victim of breast cancer and asked if I would carry the bill in the Senate. And I'm just very affectionately said, "Oh, yes," and naively said yes. Little did I know, who would think that breast cancer was not going to be supported by everyone. And, you come with, at least I came with, I was a lawyer and I had been a lawyer for some years, but little did I know that, every day was a growth process for me. And one that I will cherish forever.
Sounds like you learned how to negotiate.
Did.
Better and better each
every time with every bill. And as people, one thing I learned though, your word had to be your bond. That's all you had with your colleagues was your word. And so don't overcommit, don't commit too early, make sure you understand to what you're committing, because I've seen people, if you ever found yourself in a situation where you did not keep your word. I have seen my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, in both parties, being kind of listed as, and that's not a good thing. And that's probably just a life lesson. Let your word be your bond. And so know what you're committing, know to what you're committing before you do it.
You'd have to do a lot of reading and study before.
A lot of reading and a lot of study and know what you're voting for. I mean, I was actually a bill reader and people used to tease me about that. Well, how can you vote on this thing if you don't know what you're voting on? Really. And I don't know if that was because I was a lawyer or because I was me, but I tried to read all the bills before. He's like, you're gonna die. You can never read all this stuff. And I said, well, at least read the headings and know generally what's there. Because just as I put my mammogram bill in a funeral home bill, and so it was attached as an amendment for someone who was passionately or adamantly opposed to that for whatever reason. I mean, they had a right to know that. And the only way, and it's so fast and furious, the only way you can know that is to try to do a lot of the reading for yourself.
Does not everyone read the law?
I don't know, but I know I tried. I'm not going to comment on others.
You don't sleep
I know,
then, huh?
Yeah, I know many. I do know many.
Skim, at least.
Who really tried hard. And it's a lot to keep up with.
Well, and then when you're the chair of a committee, you have even more.
And it was interesting. 1986 was a very interesting year in the Oklahoma Senate. There had been a very vigorous campaign with our major press here in Oklahoma City. And it was called Throw the Rascals Out. And kind of that was the theme that ran through many of the, and maybe that wasn't a theme. It was maybe I was paying more attention because I was in that race running against a 22-year incumbent, running for the same seat as a 22-year incumbent. And maybe I was more, my antennas were more perched to everything around me that pertained there too. But there were a number of, the majority of the very long-term incumbent senators were ousted that year, were not reelected, both Democrat and Republican. I think about, and there were this whole class, there aren't but 48 senators, and there were a whole class of senators, particularly in Oklahoma County, that were not reelected. Very, very tenured senators from both sides of the aisle. And I recall that those of us who were the victors, the winners of those seats, we found ourselves a lot of times it would take at least a decade in a normal environment. And term limits, I think, and initially when I came in, there were not term limits, but term limits were adopted by the voters in my second at the beginning of my second term, and there was some grandfathering in for people who were there sitting at the time, but it did begin to affect some of those people. But many of my classmates in the freshman Senate class of 1986, we found ourselves getting chairs and co-chairs of very important Senate committees because there were so many incumbents, long-term incumbents, who held those seats who had been defeated. And I think initially I got a vice chairmanship of the Senate Government Operations Committee. And then it may have been the next year or at the beginning of my third year that I was named chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was just unheard of I was still considered a rookie senator. And boy, was I ever a rookie. But all of the legislation that affected the courts of Oklahoma, the employees of the courts, the judges, all of that legislation came through the Senate Judiciary Committee. So I had to grow up very quickly in the Senate. And not just me, I think many of my classmates, for similar reasons, were kind of thrust into places that for some, it was their first year, the first, second, or third year being thrust into those kinds of positions of extraordinary responsibility. We had Senate staffers who were assigned to the Senate Judiciary Committee. But then there were all of the various competing interests who might be on one side or the other of the various legislation. Workers' compensation, which is a very highly debated issue. And that list is very long of just the topics that would come through a Judiciary Committee. My very first year, I was asked by the then pro tem of the Senate, Senator Cullison from Skytook. Well, actually, Roger Randall from Tulsa was pro tem of the Senate, and he was finishing up his term. And then Senator Cullison succeeded him as pro tem of the Senate. And I was named to the Education Appropriations Committee my very first year. I mean, that's unheard of. And a number of my colleagues were named to the appropriations committees for some of the various substantive areas, education, transportation. It was large. And so a lot of us were forced to kind of grow up very, very quickly in the Senate.
Well, your leadership skills had already surfaced a little bit.
But they were kind of forced to, and they got refined or they got squished really quickly.
Well, you had been voted, back up a little bit too, you had been voted governor for Girl State. And that was a leadership role, I'm sure.
It was, but Girl State was a lot different than the Oklahoma Senate.
But that was the beginning.
But it was a good beginning. It was a good beginning. A beginning that taught me, almost like a respect and a reverence for the process. And that was an advantage as far as I was concerned. And that's why I was so upset with that editorial that somehow suggested that I had done something to get my mammogram bill passed. Maybe it was not the conventional way of how a bill becomes a law on the chart for, Chart of Instruction 101, but it certainly was a way to get your measure passed. But, you learn to have thick skin. My skin got really thick during those years. You couldn't take any of that personally. And as long as you did your work with integrity, which I think that the majority of the men and women who serve at great peril in a state legislative body.
Well, at that time when you came in '86, how many other women were with you?
In the Senate at that time, there were less than 5. Senator Maxine Horner of Tulsa was elected in my class. Senator Billy Floyd. Thank you, Billy Floyd. She was a lovely person and very zealous in her causes. From Ada. And then there was, from the other side of the aisle, there was Senator Helen Cole of, I don't know if it was Norman.
Somewhere there.
I think it was out in Norman, the Moore Norman area, because her son was also in the Senate, Tom Cole, and he was from Yukon area. Gosh, it's amazing. I should have looked at my chart before then. Senator Bernie Shedrick, and she was one of the more senior, certainly more senior women senators, and very, very effective. She was from Stillwater. Oh, I know I'm missing somebody. Oh, sorry. She was in the House when I first came to the Senate, and she later moved to the Senate. Senator Penny Williams of Tulsa, very effective senator. I'm trying to think.
I can look. That sounds about
Trish
right.
Whedon.
Okay.
Senator Trish Whedon from Purcell. And I think Senator Trish, Senator Maxine, myself. And I'm trying to remember if Senator Billy Floyd was there when I came, or did we come in the same class? She may have been there when I came. It all kind of runs together. But that was it out of a body of 48.
Did you notice any gender differences then for you?
I think, I think it was very individualized. But you just had to educate your male colleagues real quickly. I mean, I can remember my very first day that one of my, and I don't wear my femaleness on my shoulder. I don't wear my African Americanness on my shoulders. But if somebody gets out of line, and I don't have a problem letting them know that that's off limits. And one of he ended up being my leader, unnamed, obviously, but he just made the most off-color remark related to my legs the very first day, and I just kind of let loose, and I told him that it wasn't this nice. And I mean, I just couldn't believe he had said that in 1986. I got there, he was in my class too, we both got there the same way. And we never had a problem after then. And that doesn't mean that I can't accept a compliment. I'm female, I love a compliment. What female doesn't like a compliment? But that compliment was not well received because I don't think it was well intended, and I never had that problem with him again. I can think about the mammogram bill. Gosh. Just some of the things that some of my colleagues said about I can't even say it on the film.
I can imagine.
It was just. It was like the Neanderthal as far as I was concerned. I just could not believe that. And so I thought, as I was kind of negotiating through, I said, Vicki, don't get hung up. Just don't take it personally. The inappropriate characterizations of the bill. If they were going to give me a green light, because, you always are running your votes to see if you have enough to pass. You just kind of sucked it up. And I kind of went back and tried to do a minor education. I don't think I changed anybody's mind because they still persisted in referring to that bill in very derogatory ways. Same thing about some of the minority-specific legislation that I sponsored. I had a bill called the Fair Employment Practices Act, and it was really a bill to address, and it became law with much compromise, but it was to address, if you looked at the numbers, the state employees across the state, you saw if you looked at the certain levels, whether it was the top level or the middle level or the lower level of the faces of those people, in the top levels of throughout Oklahoma government, they were predominantly white men. And you did not see many ethnic minorities. You did not see many women. And I worked on this bill for about a year. And then you had the veteran preference, which is a very important preference for the men and women who have served in our armed forces. But that would trump that whole class of people. And even though they were equally and probably sometimes more qualified than someone with that veteran preference just by sheer resume to resume, they never even got the interview. It was a discretionary, it created really a fiction to allow, that was my great compromise, because my initial bill was mandatory, and that wasn't going to pass, because I had colleagues, I had some of my colleagues who in all sincerity came to me and said, Vicki, I don't have anybody minority in my whole district. And I said, well, you got women. Well, yeah, but nobody's going to care about this where I come from. And those were the kind of conversations that you would get. Well, you got to give me a reason for supporting this. And, it made me refine, some people call it horse trading, why this was important, why this made good sense for Oklahoma. Why this made good sense for the Oklahoma State Senate. And I had to, I always found myself regrouping, which is good, it's supposed to be a deliberative body. And, I learned how to do that very well. If I couldn't look my colleague in the eye and really make the case as to why I deserved their support, I didn't get it. And everything was a numbers. If you wanted your measure to become law, it came down to a numbers. I don't want to say game because it wasn't a game, but you had to have the numbers to get your bill to become law. But that bill finally became law. It was very watered down by the time it passed, but if one woman or one ethnic minority that was hired that otherwise may not have been, because of kind of the chronic nature of why they were not hired, then it was good. And I think it's still good law on the Oklahoma books. I remember having to respond to a U.S. Senator when I was being considered for the federal bench on that special emphasis legislation. I remember being in my basement trying to find the file and had to remind him that it would not have passed, it would not have been signed into law by the governor if it had been unconstitutional, and that's where your Senate staff comes into that process. But it's very interesting, very interesting. I can remember I had hearings with, there was a lady in the House at the time named Vicki White, and it created advisory task force on child care. At that time, just the whole global nature of child care facilities at that time were regulated by the Department of Human Services, and it just took a comprehensive look over about an 8-month period of many, many hearings at child care. We were looking at things like worksite child care facilities, something that the feds had in 1995 when the Murrah building bombing occurred. That child care center was a worksite child care facility over in the Murrah building. Looking at the reimbursement rates for child care for women on public assistance. Looking at it took a comprehensive look at child care, and people were like, you're the big senator from Oklahoma City who chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee. Why would you care about child care issues? But I was very concerned, and I'm sure it was because of the district that I represented. I was very concerned about quality of life issues. Child care is a real issue. It's not an issue if you can just afford to pay it and can afford the best that's available, but most Oklahoma women may not be able to afford that. And I don't mean women on public assistance necessarily, but they deserve a quality of child care just like the woman who can afford to pay top dollar for the finest care in her home, right. And bring the child care provider to their home, which is probably the highest and the best. Well, the highest and the best would probably be a mama that can afford to stay home and raise those babies. But I did care about those quality of life issues because those are the kinds of issues I believed and still believe affect, the quality of little people that grow into big people and
run the country someday.
And run the country someday. So I really cared a lot about those kinds of, in addition to issues involving the courts and matters of law and justice, I really cared a lot about literacy. They were kind of fundamental issues for me. If you can't read, how can you do it? And how can you even drive? Mm-hmm. Do you just know the shapes of the signs? And red means stop and yellow means yield?
Sunday.
Mm-hmm. So, but I loved my service in the Oklahoma Senate.
And what prompted you to leave it instead of run again?
Probably an offer to be considered, being considered as the chief federal prosecutor here in Oklahoma City in 1994. And I remember just really when that opportunity presented itself, and I had been a career prosecutor, state and federal, by that point in my life, as a lawyer, which was my chosen profession. And I can remember just literally almost agonizing about leaving the Senate. Sure, the pay was much better, the responsibility was different. The branch of government was different. It was being in the executive branch, the law enforcement branch, rather than the branch which probably is closest to the people, the legislative branch, the law-making branch. Very, very different kinds of hats. And I pondered and I prayed and I, talked to the people who I knew would have my back either way, my family. And I can remember because it was then David Walters was the governor, and he was going to have to set a special election for my seat because it was in the middle of my term. Mm-hmm. And because I had been reelected without opposition in 1990. And this was 1993, so my term had a little bit more than a year left in my term. I can remember he kept trying to get my resignation letter because he needed to do what process-wise, all of the things, which was a lot, according to the state election board, to set the election. I kept thinking, bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. And that letter, I think I delivered my letter on the day of my swearing in, and I kind of wanted to wait until after. And they were like, "You can't hold to give us that letter," But for me, that was my life, and I was giving up something that, well, obviously I had decided by then that was in my best interest to move on. But sometimes things present themselves to you, and it's not part of any plan that you had for yourself. I mean, I loved being representing the people of the state of Oklahoma, as a sex crimes prosecutor, just like I loved representing the people of the United States, as a federal prosecutor.
You were one of the first women to do that too, weren't you?
Yeah. Yes, I was. At the federal level here, the appointment by President Clinton in 1993. And but I loved my Senate service.
Well, and while you were in the Senate, you went to Dublin, Ireland, or was that
I went to Dublin
before?
Yeah. There was an international summit of women, and it was so eye-opening for me. I guess that was my second opportunity to travel abroad. My first time was as a student at Vassar College, and I did summer abroad at the University of Ghana in West Africa. And so that was in circa summer 74. And so the next time I went abroad, I was a state senator, and I went to this International Summit of Women. And there were women from places that I had never heard of, that I really did not know where those small countries were. And the women were from all around the globe. And it was such an eye-opener for me because, sometimes we think the issues that consume our own little patch are the issues of the day. And I was so... I think that's the Children's Defense Fund, that motto that says, "The sea is so wide and my boat is so small." That's how I felt at this conference. And probably the one issue that was pervasive, you know what it was? Clean water.
It's not just a women's issue.
It's not just a woman, it's a human issue. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I so much could take for granted in an industrialized, modernized nation like the United States of America. Water, come on. It's not an issue for me in Oklahoma, But it was, and at the time, Mary Smith was the president of Ireland. And we got to go to the White House there in Ireland and meet her. And she was very present at that meeting. And Mary Smith, right? Mary Smith. I think it's Mary Smith. I think that's right. God, I said, is it Mary Smith? Yeah, I think that's right.
First answer is usually correct.
It's a long time ago. But it was a phenomenal experience. And I think that would be what later really, that and the Ghana experience piqued my interest in matters of international concern.
Well, then you served as a delegate to the Soviet Union,
right? I forgot about that. That same time in my years in the Senate. There's a bipartisan group called the American Council of Young Political Leaders, and it's a Washington-based group, and that group sponsors exchanges for back then it was legislative. I don't know if they did executive branch. I think now ACYPL is now doing some judicial branch exchanges between the Soviet Union and many other countries. But then the push was for legislative branch and also appointed officials as well as elected officials. I remember there were 5 delegates in my group, and there was me. I was a Democratic senator from Oklahoma. There was a Republican representative from somewhere. There was somebody from the Heritage, it's not called the Heritage Association. It's a fairly conservative think tank, policy think tank out of Washington. There was somebody from a California group, and then there was an appointed official from Nevada or somewhere. So we all were, really spanned the stretch of political thought.
Well, how did you get chosen? I mean, what was the process of?
I don't know. I don't know how they got to me, but it was great that they did, and it was so instructive. And I found myself in the then Soviet Union in December of 1990, which was the time I was in the then Soviet Union when the transition occurred from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation, and it was extraordinary. I mean, it was like I could not believe that I had an opportunity. I mean, I just felt like I was growing up really fast, being introduced to a culture at such a very historic time, and that certainly piqued my interest. We got to meet Boris Yeltsin, and it was phenomenal. It was 3 phenomenal weeks, the coldest weeks ever, but it was a very interesting time to
pinch yourself to see if it was real.
Yeah, to be in Russia. I have no idea how I got there.
None at all.
Well, there was a man from Oklahoma who was involved. His name was Danny McDonald. And I think he used to be with the Corporation Commission, and at the time he lived in Washington. But he was an Oklahoman who at that time was very involved with the affairs of ACYPL, and they are still quite a viable group and have expanded their reach far beyond what they were doing back in the 90s. But it gives me chills to think about it.
An exciting time.
It was. It really was.
Okay, well, since leaving the House, or since leaving the Senate, rather, you were a judge.
The U.S. Attorney first.
And then.
And now on the federal bench.
And you were appointed to the bench?
I was appointed to the bench, and I was the U.S. Attorney for less than 24 months because there was a vacancy that occurred when Judge Lee West was ready to take senior status. And that vacancy, his decision created a vacancy on that bench, and I was encouraged and did put myself forward. Senator, then United States Senator David Bourne was my sponsoring senator who sponsored my nomination for both Chief Federal Prosecutor and for the federal bench. And for that, of course, I am forever grateful. I never, some people do things looking for the next piece. Mm-hmm. At the time that the Chief Federal Prosecutor, the U.S. Attorney, presented itself as a possible opportunity, it was nothing that I had particularly thought about. I had a fairly, my entire career up until that time. I never practiced privately until I was a senator. Probably if I could have still been a prosecutor, I would have still been a prosecutor. And I had great training at both the Department of Justice, and I was in non-litigating sections at the department. Had a great, Bob Macy was the district attorney, but I worked directly under a long-time sex crimes prosecutor named Barry Albert, who was a phenomenal prosecutor, very skillful, very fair, but very unrelenting. And I learned from the best. He's deceased now. And I had, on the judge score, I had never thought about either one of those. I was perfectly satisfied and was working very hard as a state senator. And I was kind of beginning to move up in the ranks of that body. But it just hadn't occurred to me I'm a big advocate of blooming where you're planted. And the people said I could serve in District 48, and I gave it 150%.
And then term limits came into play. And this is a permanent, your lifetime appointment for you.
Where I am now, yeah. Which is kind of, I still pinch myself thinking, wow, it's quite a...
And are there other women in Oklahoma that hold that similar?
There is. Our current chief judge here in the Western District of Oklahoma is Judge Robin Cothran, and I will become the chief judge next year in 2008. A little soon, but some of the judges, it's a matter of seniority. Judge David Russell, who is our senior, he is still on active status, but he has served as the chief. And two judges that were in line and ahead of me took senior status and did not become chief judge. So that's why I'm probably 14 years earlier than I otherwise would have been.
And how long can you hold that?
7 years. And so I'll be doing that.
You know what you'll be doing the next 7 years.
You know what I'll be doing, right? And it's a wonderful. I love our court here in the Western District of Oklahoma. As I go to national training meetings and so forth, the Thurgood Marshall Federal Judiciary Center sponsors a lot of our training, and kind of continuing education is made available through the Federal Judicial Center out of Washington, D.C. And so you get to know many of your colleagues around the country through training and other meetings that we attend. And I know that our court here in the Western District is exceptionally collegial, and which is not always the case, unfortunately. But you're a body joined together by the narrow confines of your existence, your constitutional existence, and there are many limitations, as there should be, and the framers were probably quite astute when they created a lot of the restrictions, but there should be a lot of restrictions, and they make sense, and I certainly understand the reasons why they exist, but they kind of narrow your world. They really do. But as they probably should, in a position that's a person can hold for life. Constitution says it's a lifetime appointment, or so long as they shall have good behavior, and that's been interpreted in the case law. Obviously, if somebody commits a crime or so forth, they're not going to get to hold that very coveted position anymore. But it's work of tremendous responsibility.
What do you think you would have gotten there without having served time in the Senate, USC?
Well, see, it's just not a typical route.
No.
It's not a typical route. And
if it's destiny, it would have come anyway, wouldn't it?
Only the good Lord knows that from my vantage point. But,
So the next step after this is what? What would be the next?
I don't know. I just like to bloom where I'm planted, Dr. Finchum. I don't know.
Let's say you're blooming quite well.
do good where I am. I've had an opportunity. Federal courts are courts of very limited jurisdiction. We do handle both civil and criminal cases by statute. But one of the exceptional opportunities that I've enjoyed as a member of the federal courts. The federal courts govern themselves through an entity called the Judicial Conference of the United States, and that committee is chaired, the conference is chaired by the Chief Justice, and there are a number of committees that make up the Judicial Conference of the United States. The Criminal Law Committee, the State Federal Jurisdiction Committee, the Civil Procedure Committee. One of those committees is called the International Judicial Relations Committee, and it's a committee of judges that respond to all kinds of requests from foreign judiciaries on matters pertaining to the administration of justice or the rule of law. You might think, oh, that's going to be a travel. Nothing was ever sexy on that committee. I mean, you went to very challenged developing countries. I did quite a bit of work with the Law Reform and Law Revision Commission of the Republic of Rwanda post-genocide. I got to do work in Kenya, in South America, and this is not the only judges. Many state court judges also assist our foreign colleagues. It was nothing sexy about that committee, but it was an extraordinary opportunity to be able to, whether that judge is in Brazil, which is where I've had an opportunity to do work, or in China. I was there. I'm not on the committee anymore because you can only serve 2 3-year terms, because they encourage judges, all of us in the federal judiciary, to do some service on a judicial conference committee. I mean, I still get contacted by the public diplomacy section of State Department to do work, and I don't do as much of it as I did during that 6-year window. But it's what a wonderful, I think I'm a better judge in America because of the opportunity to do some of that work around the globe. And it may take on, you never know kind of what the request is. And like I said, the federal court is not the only group of judges responding to those kinds of requests, but a lot is certainly done through the kind of goodwill of that committee, and the sharing, the exchange about how we do what we do, whether it's in the area of court administration, and then, you have civil law jurisdictions and common law jurisdictions. America obviously is a common law jurisdiction, so you've got vast differences in kind of doing the day-to-day depending on the origins of that country's law. So it's been a very fascinating and interesting aspect of my work during that period of time, and has kind of piqued some interest in me that I didn't even know I had.
Well, your skill set that you've learned along the way is still coming into play too. And we're running out of time for you. Do we need to begin you out of here again?
Probably.
Well, yes.
Sure.
One last question.
Oh, that's okay.
I've asked all the other ones, so I need to ask you, when history's written about you, what would you like for it to say?
That she served with a passion, really. I mean, that that's why I feel so privileged and so blessed, because I haven't been anywhere professionally that I just haven't just kind of marveled and just really cherished the opportunity to serve, because that's what it is. I mean, the voters gave it to me in those 7.5 years or so in the Oklahoma State Senate, and I think what I was entrusted with is something very sacred and something very special. And I worked every day at the Oklahoma Senate like I believed that it was something that was very precious to me, that trust. I didn't mean everybody liked me because they didn't. My grandmother used to say, used to read the paper every day, and you thought, oh God, that doesn't look very nice. I'm not that horrible person they're making me out to be, And sometimes you just had to say, well, today, my grandmother used to say, today's headlines are tomorrow's fish wrappings, So you just kind of, that's just part of it. Everybody's not going to like you. And I said I grew some very thick skin during that period of time, and I did. I mean, if you take it personally, you don't need to be in any kind of elected position, because most of what was not about who you were, but was about what you were advocating. That it kind of goes back to that interest. What is the interest being advocated here? And as U.S. Attorney, that was an awesome job with awesome responsibility. The decision to charge or to not charge a person, the discretion involved in that is a very, again, very sacred kind of trust that requires deliberation, that requires good evidence, that requires a whole different set of skills. But that, I think, in all of my professional career, the public trust that has been entrusted, because I've had a very public career. I'm not a wealthy person by any means. I mean, anybody wants to be rich, I tell them, if you tell young people, if you want to make a lot of money, government is not your venue. It's just not. And now the courts, the federal courts, the trust, the oath that I took, to honor the Constitution, to follow the law. That's awesome. Even it doesn't matter what I think, what Vicki thinks. Each one of these positions, what Vicki thinks becomes less and less important in the scheme of things. But what's entrusted is it's overwhelming, and when you really think about it, when I really think about it, sometimes I think, ooh, it's a lot. It's a big load. It's a big load, but I honor it, I cherish it, I respect it, and I revere it, and I just hope that that's what I'll be remembered for, is being passionate about my service, my public service.
I'd say you've accomplished
that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your second time here.
Okay, thank
It's
you.
been fun.